The morning it all began, I was steering my truck toward my home, coffee still steaming in the cup holder, when I saw it. A massive white tent, pitched right across my driveway like some kind of carnival setup. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake, that some rental company had delivered the tent to the wrong house. But as I slowed down, my heart sank. The bold banner strung across the canopy read, HOA Summer Gala. My driveway, the entrance to my own property, was buried under folding chairs, tables, and decorations, as if I didn't even exist. My brakes screeched as I stopped in front of the barricade, staring at the sight that would turn an ordinary Saturday into a battle I never saw coming. What the HOA didn't realize, what made me smirk even as frustration boiled in my veins, was that by blocking me out, they had opened the door to a revenge they couldn't even imagine. I'm Tom, 54 years old, a man who has lived long enough to know that peace is earned, not handed over. After 3 decades of working as an auto mechanic, saving every penny and fixing up cars on weekends, I bought myself the kind of house I'd always dreamed about. A modest but solid home tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac, with a wide driveway big enough to hold my truck, my wife's sedan, and the vintage car I'd been restoring piece by piece for years. That driveway wasn't just a slab of concrete. It was the runway for my pride. Every vehicle I parked there carried memories, late nights under the hood, busted knuckles, greasy shirts, and satisfaction money couldn't buy. And now, here it was, buried under streamers, balloons, and smugness. The HOA had always been a thorn in my side, but never like this. I should have known trouble was coming. Their president, Meredith, had a reputation for wielding authority like a sledgehammer. She was in her early 50s, the kind of person who strutted around with a clipboard as though it were a royal decree. She had already fined me twice that year, once for leaving my recycling bin out half a day too long, and once because my lawn had a patch of clover mixed in with the grass. The neighbors whispered about her, rolled their eyes when she passed, but nobody wanted to take her on. She loved the power too much, and she loved humiliating anyone who resisted her rules even more. Blocking my driveway with her so-called community event wasn't an accident. It was a message. The timing was no coincidence either. That morning, I had planned to drive into town to pick up rare parts for my vintage car restoration. Parts one had waited months to track down. I had the cash ready, the seller lined up, everything set. But as I sat in my truck, staring at that circus pitched across my property, my stomach twisted with anger. Meredith and her HOA crew were bustling under the tent, setting up tables of food, coolers of drinks, and neatly arranged rows of folding chairs. Not one of them glanced my way. To them, my inconvenience didn't matter. They thought I would simply park somewhere else, walk across the street, and swallow my pride while they celebrated their self-importance on my land. But they had underestimated me. All my life, I've learned that bullies thrive only when people stay quiet. On construction sites, in mechanic shops, in neighborhoods just like this one, I've seen the same pattern. People put their heads down, pay the fine, let the authority figure bark orders, and try not to stir the pot. I wasn't wired that way. I'd spent too many years fighting for what was mine. I wasn't about to let a group of clipboard tyrants steal my driveway and pretend it was theirs as the sun climbed higher and the tent bustled with chatter. I parked my truck right at the edge of the blockade, engine idling, eyes narrowed. My driveway might have been covered, but my mind was already racing faster than the pistons in a drag car. If Meredith wanted to make a spectacle, then a spectacle she would get. What none of them realized was that I had spent years surrounded by cars, titles, paperwork, auctions, and buyers. If there was one thing I knew better than anyone in that neighborhood, it was how to turn a car into leverage. They had given me the perfect stage, right in front of my house, and I was going to use it. The thought hit me like a spark catching dry grass. If they wanted to block my driveway with their event, then I would turn their event into mine. They wanted to flaunt their authority in front of the whole community? I'd put on a show they would never forget. And this wasn't going to be a simple outburst or a petty act of defiance. No, this was going to be calculated, precise, and devastatingly public. Because bullies like Meredith didn't just need to be stopped, they needed to be exposed. And I knew exactly how to do it. The HOA prided themselves on their fancy vehicles. Meredith herself drove a spotless luxury SUV, the kind of car she polished every weekend like it was a trophy. Her vice president, Carl, had a flashy convertible he never shut up about. and nearly every one of the board members parked their cars like ornaments along the street, as if showcasing their wealth gave them authority. Watching them hustle between their tent and their precious cars, I felt my anger harden into resolve. They had turned my driveway into their stage. Soon, I'd turn their cars into mine. What began as frustration transformed into a plan that would burn itself into neighborhood history. My driveway might have been stolen for a few hours, but I was about to seize something far greater. They had poked the wrong man, and the show I was about to put on would leave every resident whispering about it for years to come. This wasn't just payback, it was justice. The plan didn't materialize overnight. It grew like an engine being rebuilt piece by piece, each bolt tightened with intention. First, I walked the perimeter of the tinted mess pretending to be a sympathetic neighbor, though every step only confirmed how brazen Meredith had been. I watched the faces under the canopy, cataloged the cars parked like sentries along the street, and memorized license plates as if they were components in a parts catalog. There was strategy in observation. Next came logistics. To turn their vehicles into leverage, I needed legitimacy, paperwork, and an audience, something Meredith had already provided for me by staging this ostentatious event. I hurried back to my garage where grease-stained blueprints, auction flyers, and a faded clipboard lived among spare carburetors and boxes labeled with part numbers. I pulled out an old dealer's manual I'd kept from my younger days when I used to broker classic cars on the side. It contained forms, bill of sale templates, and enough jargon to make anything look official. If there was one thing I'd learned wrenching and selling, it was that people believe paperwork. I spent the late morning drafting a mock neighborhood auction flyer, simple, bold letters announcing a public car auction, free to attend, open to the community. I printed a handful and stapled them to the telephone poles in the cul-de-sac, not to hide what I was doing, but to announce it. The audacity of it felt right. Meredith had dared to make a public spectacle of excluding me, so I responded with a spectacle of my own that would be impossible for her to ignore. Then I called in favors. Old Bob from next door owed me for fixing his mower last summer, and the Martins liked me enough to bring over hand-rolled pies whenever something important happened. I explained the situation without theatrics and asked for their help in spreading the word. They didn't need much convincing. There was a weary hunger in the neighborhood for someone to stand up to the HOA's petty tyrannies. Quiet about it for months, folks had been waiting for permission to stop being afraid. My flyer gave them that permission. While neighbors talked and curiosity spread, I crossed the legal T's. I dug out county enforcement rules about abandoned or unregistered vehicles, and how community associations could petition for lien sales if owners were not in compliance. My knowledge wasn't that of a lawyer, but it was enough to craft a scenario where, at the very least, public embarrassment would force action. If nothing else, the spectacle would humiliate Meredith and her cohort in front of everyone, and humiliation is a potent force in small communities. The next step was practical. I needed a safe location to stage the auction and a band of volunteers to act as marshals. My garage doubled as an operations hub. I recruited 2 retired buddies who trusted me and could lift a bumper if needed. I also called a towing company I knew from earlier disputes over abandoned cars on the highway. Not to illegally tow anyone's vehicle without cause, but to have them on standby in case a legal avenue presented itself. Everything hinged on timing and plausible process. As the afternoon sun warmed the street, the neighborhood's whispers thickened into real momentum. People who had dodged Meredith's glare for years started nodding when they passed. A teenager riding his bike slowed to read the flyer. A young couple walking their dog peeked under the tent with an expression that mixed amusement and disbelief. Momentum, I realized, was as contagious as a rumor, and I had set it loose. With a crowd forming, I turned my attention to the vehicles themselves. I had to be careful. The last thing I wanted was to be accused of theft or vandalism. Instead, I focused on documentation. I took photos of cars parked conspicuously on HOA land, photographed license plates that matched names on trustee lists, and cross-referenced them with registration records I accessed online from the county database. Some registrations were current, others expired. A couple of cars belonged to board members who, according to public records, lived a block away but used HOA property as extended parking. The inconsistencies were telling. More importantly, they gave me leverage in front of a crowd that loved a story of hypocrisy. By evening, The tent was still up and the HOA was enjoying the galas hors d'oeuvres while the street hummed with anticipation. I distributed more flyers and posted a short notice on the neighborhood's private social feed that an impromptu community auction would begin in an hour near Meredith's tent, featuring vehicles of interest. The wording was intentionally ambiguous. It sounded lawful enough to pull in curious onlookers without promising actual transaction of private property. That ambiguity was my shield and my sword. As neighbors gathered, the event revealed itself as part civic theater, part neighborhood catharsis. People chatted about minor slights, about fines that had felt unfair, about the time Meredith had lectured an elderly resident for an overgrown potted plant. The tent owners noticed the crowd swelling at their perimeter and shifted uneasily, their laughter thinning like streamers deflating. Meredith, true to form, took the center of the tent like a general and attempted to assert control, but this time the audience wasn't a captive one. When I stepped forward with my binder, no grandstanding, just steady movements like an engineer demonstrating a repair, the air shifted. I walked the quiet line between righteous indignation and legalistic calm, presenting the photographs of HOA cars parked on association land, showing registrations that didn't line up, and pointing out the irony of an organization that preached rules while flouting them in plain sight. I didn't shout, the evidence did the talking. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Curiosity hardened into skepticism about the HOA's invincibility. The tent that once felt like an impenetrable fort now looked exposed, like a stage whose actors were suddenly unsure of their script. What made the crowd lean toward action wasn't just the evidence. It was the recognition of power being rebalanced in real time. Neighbors who had previously tolerated small humiliations found their voices rising in the same cadence as the collector's auctioneers on TV. Faster, sharper, irrevocable. They began to imagine a world where their own petty grievances could be aired and addressed, where the clipboard no longer signified untouchable authority. As the sun set and the gala's lights flickered on, a hush fell over the crowd when the towing company rolled up, not to seize cars on the spot, but to remind the board that the enforcement mechanisms existed and could be invoked if violations went unaddressed. It was a quiet threat, procedural and real, and the sight of the tow truck's silhouette against the string lights felt like a harbinger. Meredith's composure cracked in a way I had not expected to savor, but did. Her cheeks burned red, and the clipboard she gripped trembled slightly. The tent, once a banner of exclusion, had become a theater for accountability, and the neighbors, long audience members in her stage performances, were finally turning their attention back to the script with new eyes. The auction had not yet sold a single car, but it had sold the idea that rules could be enforced equally, and that realization was more dangerous to Meredith than any public reprimand. The real work had only begun. The next day would be about sealing the procedural cracks that would make the fantasy of an equal enforcement auction into something that could not be easily dismissed. Be why the next morning the neighborhood felt transformed. The residue of the gala replaced by an electricity that pulsed through every driveway and front porch. The tent still sagged across my property line, the folding chairs half collapsed and the trash cans overflowing, but its presence no longer carried the weight of intimidation. Instead, it stood as a symbol of Meredith's overreach, a reminder of her arrogance, and an opportunity for me to escalate. I walked my driveway with a clipboard of my own, not in imitation but in defiance, recording the condition of each car that had been showcased at the event. Some had expired registrations, others were parked on the wrong side of property lines, and one belonged to Carl, the vice president, whose convertible had been illegally modified without county inspection. Each detail became another nut tightened on the machine of accountability I was building. My goal wasn't vandalism or sabotage, it was exposure. A bully only survives when the shadows conceal them, and my task was to shine every light available. The auction framework grew in scale that day. Word spread beyond the cul-de-sac, reaching residents from adjoining streets who had suffered in silence under the HOA's heavy-handedness. Families who had been fined for children's toys left. In yards, retirees cited for harmless garden ornaments, and couples warned about harmless holiday lights all came to my driveway. What had begun as curiosity now evolved into solidarity. People offered stories, documents, even photographs of Meredith's selective enforcement. A woman named Clara handed me a stack of violation letters she had received over 2 years for trivial reasons, and every one of them bore Meredith's signature like a scarlet stamp. These testimonies became the fuel of my auction stage, proof that my retaliation wasn't petty but collective, rooted in the frustration of dozens of households who had endured enough. It'd be why late afternoon the stage was set for a more formal demonstration. I erected a small canopy at the edge of my driveway. Nothing elaborate, just a folding table, a loudspeaker borrowed from Bob, and a stack of paperwork that looked every bit like official auction materials. The flyer announcing the neighborhood car auction had already circulated enough to draw a crowd. When people gathered, it wasn't merely to watch cars being hypothetically sold, it was to watch the balance of power shift. Each car belonging to an HOA board member became a lot number on my clipboard. Meredith's luxury SUV, Carl's convertible, the treasurer's pickup, all listed with photographs and notes about their technical or regulatory shortcomings. I explained in measured tones that these vehicles, by the HOA's own standards, were out of compliance and subject to enforcement. The spectacle was symbolic, yet in that symbolism lay the most devastating strike: the realization that if rules applied to me, they applied to them too, with no exceptions. Neighbors who once whispered now raised their voices. Bids were shouted in mock seriousness. $50 for the SUV, $100 for the convertible, and laughter mingled with anger in a way that felt cathartic. Each joke bid was really a protest, each chuckle an expression of rebellion. The crowd no longer feared Meredith's glares, they savored them. The board members tried to wave it off as nonsense, but the noise drowned them. Their pride, those polished cars they flaunted as symbols of authority, were now reduced to props in a performance they couldn't control. The arrival of local media tipped the scales further. A freelance journalist who covered community disputes had heard about the auction through the neighborhood's online chatter and arrived with a camera. She documented the gathering, interviewed frustrated residents, and filmed the rows of vehicles lined up like inventory. Meredith attempted to intercept, painting herself as a leader preserving order, but the footage of her flustered explanations alongside the auction chants told a different story. The next day's headlines would inevitably frame it as residents rising against HOA tyranny, and once the narrative left the confines of the neighborhood, Meredith's fortress of control would be exposed to the wider county. Even more potent was the legal layer now hardening beneath the theater. With the help of my attorney friend, I filed complaints documenting the HOA board's misuse of association land for private vehicle storage, expired registrations among their prized cars, and unauthorized tent construction that had blocked my driveway without consent. Each filing was timed to coincide with the spectacle so that by the time Meredith tried to dismiss the auction as a prank, she would be buried under legitimate scrutiny. It was no longer about humor or revenge. It was about accountability on every front, public and legal. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple, I stood at the edge of my driveway watching neighbors linger long after the auction had ended. They talked openly, voices strong and confident, no longer glancing over their shoulders for fear of fines or reprimands. The atmosphere felt different, like a dam had burst. The HOA's power had always been rooted in silence, but silence had been shattered. The tent still cluttered my driveway, but its presence no longer angered me. It had become the stage of their downfall, and soon it would be the wreckage left behind by a toppled regime. But I wasn't done. The mock auction was only the opening salvo, a declaration that the rules worked both ways. The final act, I knew, had to be bigger, undeniable, and humiliating enough to dismantle Meredith's throne once and for all. That would come soon, and when it did, it would not only return my driveway, but also restore the neighborhood's voice. For now, I let the crowd disperse, my clipboard heavy with evidence, my resolve harder than ever. The cars parked smugly on the street glistened under the street lamps, unaware that their role in Meredith's empire was ending. They were no longer status symbols. They were the very tools of her undoing. The climax arrived faster than even I had anticipated, carried on the momentum of neighbors who had discovered their courage and the paper trail that now lay stacked in my garage like ammunition. The morning after the mock auction, the neighborhood buzzed with a kind of defiance that couldn't be silenced. The flyers had reached beyond our cul-de-sac, and other residents in nearby streets appeared curious to see how far I was willing to push. The county office, tipped by both my filings and the journalist's coverage, dispatched an inspector to verify the tent's legality and review the complaints against the board's vehicles. It was a perfect storm: public spectacle, legal oversight, and a neighborhood no longer willing to cower. The inspector's findings were swift and damning. The tent had been erected without proper permits, directly blocking residential access. Several of the HOA board's vehicles were discovered with expired registrations or improper parking, precisely as I had documented. The very evidence Meredith and her allies dismissed as a stunt was now stamped with official county authority. The inspector left warning notices on windshields, each bright paper fluttering like a victory flag. The sight of those notices was enough to ignite the final stage of my plan. The towing company I had kept on standby didn't need coaxing once the county's notices were in place. By law, unregistered or improperly parked vehicles on association land could be impounded, and with my documentation paired to the inspector's findings, the path was clear. The tow trucks rolled in by mid-afternoon, their heavy chains clinking like a drum roll before a performance. Neighbors gathered instinctively, some standing on porches, others lining the street, the air thick with anticipation. One by one, the trucks maneuvered into position, each hooking onto a car that had once been polished as a display of authority. Meredith's luxury SUV, gleaming under the harsh sun, was the first to be lifted. The crowd erupted in a mix of gasps and cheers, the spectacle now undeniable. The vehicle rose awkwardly, like a throne being toppled, and as it was hauled onto the flatbed, the power Meredith had brandished for years seemed to vanish with it. Carl's convertible followed, then the treasurer's pickup, each dragged away in humiliating succession. The laughter and applause that followed weren't cruel. They were cathartic, the release of years of pent-up frustration finally finding a voice. Meredith tried to resist, her protests ringing out as shrill commands. But the trucks didn't answer to her clipboard. They answered to the county's orders, to the evidence filed, to the rules she had believed applied only to others. The journalist returned to capture the scene, her camera lens fixed on Meredith's panicked gestures as her once untouchable fleet vanished down the street. By the time the third vehicle was gone, Meredith's authority was no longer questioned but openly mocked. Children whispered about the auction that had come true. Teenagers filmed the tow trucks for social media, and adults shook hands with me, their relief evident in every gesture. What had begun as my battle for a driveway had become the neighborhood's liberation from years of intimidation. As the final car disappeared, the tent still stood across my driveway, sagging under the weight of neglect and irrelevance. It no longer felt like an obstacle, but like debris, the remnants of a toppled empire. The board held an emergency meeting that evening, but few attended. The neighbors had made their choice, their loyalty no longer chained to Meredith's empty threats. Within days, a vote of no confidence stripped her of her presidency. The board fractured, and fines once wielded like weapons were rescinded. The county levied penalties on the board for unpermitted structures and improper vehicle storage, leaving Meredith not just embarrassed, but financially cornered. Her SUV sat in impound for weeks, her attempts at appeals mocked by the very neighbors who once bowed to her. For me, the victory was measured not only in the return of my driveway, but in the quiet that followed. I cleared the last remnants of the tent myself, sweeping away the trash and folding the abandoned chairs, each scrape of the broom a reminder that peace had been reclaimed. I parked my truck squarely in the center of my driveway, the vintage car restoration glinting proudly beside it, and felt the satisfaction of a space once stolen restored by my refusal to yield. The neighbors, newly emboldened, began to live differently too. Lawns grew a little more freely without fear of fines. Children's toys returned to yards. Wind chimes rang on porches, and conversations bloomed where silence once lingered. The cul-de-sac no longer felt like Meredith's kingdom, but like a community, each resident a part of its chorus. Looking back, I realized the revenge wasn't just about humiliating Meredith or watching her vehicles vanish on tow trucks. It was about showing everyone, including myself, that bullies only rule when silence protects them. The auction had been symbolic, but its results were real. I hadn't sold their vehicles for profit. I had sold their illusion of power, dismantled it piece by piece until nothing remained but accountability. My driveway had been the battlefield, but the victory belonged to everyone who had been quietly waiting for someone to lead the charge. And now, with my coffee steaming in hand and the driveway clear under the morning sun, I understood that the strongest justice wasn't loud or violent. It was precise, patient, and unforgettable.